What is up, guys? Dane again. Now, if you're subscribed to this channel, you've probably gotten pretty used to the fact that I have a lot of car stuff in my garage, yet I'm always talking about Facebook ads. Well, today I'm going to try to change that around, and we're going to be talking about car stuff. Now, if you haven't noticed, I am kind of a Ford person. Yes, I have actually had Fords since I was in high school. I've had Toyotas and other cars too, but I've always stuck with Fords, namely Mustangs. I've had about 5 Mustangs in my short lifespan on this earth. I've pretty much have driven everything from the S550, the S197, both the earlier and the later versions, the SN95, and the Fox body. The only thing I really haven't touched is a Classic or a Mustang 2, though those are probably going to be coming down the way anyways. I will have to say, while driving all the cars are great and they all have their own pluses and minuses, it's becoming really obvious that the SN95 is the ugly stepchild. It doesn't have the same sort of nostalgic vintage rawness that the Fox body have, nor does it really have the refinement and the power that the S197, especially the S550s have. It's kind of in the middle. You know, power-wise, it isn't as good as the newer cars. And then it's also not quite, old school enough to appease the people in the Fox body camp that like things really light and really, really simple. So the SN95 really kind of sucks if you think about it. In this video, I'm going to tell you the 5 reasons why the SN95 sucks. First area that the SN95 really does seem to suck is in the build quality. And when I mean build quality, I'm talking about the interior build quality. You are surrounded by a lot of cheap, really groany plastic. Now granted, the Fox body probably has this worse, but you expect the Fox body to have it worse. I mean, look at it. It looks like an overgrown Ford Escort. I actually had a Ford Escort too. And I'm not hating on the Fox body. I had 2 of them, but it feels like a cheap car because it looks like a cheap car and it was made to be a cheap car. The SN95, they really were trying to make this look like a cool, futuristic, new sporty car. And in 1994, the build quality was probably right on par. The problem is that they kept that same 1994 build quality all the way to 2004. I remember when I was in high school, I had a Motor Trend magazine, which unfortunately I don't have anymore. It was in 2004 when the supercharged Mustang Cobra was facing off against the Corvette. One thing that was just in the cons area was just the interior. I forgot which author was the one that wrote it, but he pretty much said, the interior of the Mustang feels like it's already 5 years old. Well, that's true because at that time it was 10. Yes, the SN95 on the exterior did have a big refresh around 1999, but interior-wise it was more like, let's swap a couple of different parts in there, change a couple of colors, and call it a day. I swear the worst part about the SN95 has to be the door handles. Most of them are probably broken. There is a way on how to properly install them. I'll make a video on how to do it because even in my Roush stage 2, sure enough, someone has broken off the little tab on the bottom, so they'd like to pull out every so often. So to sum that up, pretty much the interior build quality it's not bad, but it sure does make it look like an outdated car compared to, say, the later S197s, even the earlier S197s, and the S550. It's kind of funny when people say the S550 has kind of a mediocre interior. I'm like, dude, you have no idea how far they've come. Now, the next area where the SN95 really sucks, and this is more for the earlier SN95s, has to be the non-PI 4.6. When the SN95 did come out in 1994, the V8 option was still the old school pushrod 5.0, which has a huge following, huge fan base, great aftermarket support, and Ford decided to go ahead and drop that engine and plop in the non-PI 4.6. If you have a 1999 or newer Mustang, you have the PI, which has the 260 horsepower. At that time, it was actually pretty respectable. Personally, I think it's more than adequate. Not fast, but adequate for my autocross needs. However, the 4.6 really was kind of a wet rag. I mean, technically on paper, it has the same amount of horsepower that the older pushrod 5.0 had, but just imagine and put yourself in that time period to see the new 1996 Mustang with the new 4.6 engine, which is really smooth, but is slower in the quarter mile. See, the older school pushrod 5.0 engine had more down-low torque, while the 4.6 is known to be a much revier engine. So yeah, you're getting a much smoother and revvier engine, but now you're going slower. And all those 5.0 pushrod parts that are just sitting on the shelves everywhere, you don't have any of them. Now it is nice that in 1998 they did give a small little power bump to about 235 horsepower, but really the 4.6 really didn't start to get any sort of love until about 1999 with the PI engine. Let's not talk about the fact that GM was already, just crushing the horsepower at that point, but hey, we survived. But definitely the second reason why the SN95 sucks has to be the non-PI 4.6. It is just a grandma spec Crown Victoria engine that they just dropped into the Mustang. Perform-wise, it isn't bad, but it really isn't that great. I think that's actually rather unfortunate because my first Mustang was an SN95 V6. Yes, the V6 is not a great performance engine, never was meant to be. I think they sound okay, but the SN95 is a very good looking car. In my opinion, they should have just kept the old school 5.0 pushrod in the Mustang all the way to 1998, and then unveil the single overhead cam 4.6 in 1999 with the 260 horsepower. You will have had the increase in power, and it would actually make a little bit of sense. Okay, new body style, new engine, more powerful engine than the old body style and the old engine. To me, it would have just made a lot more sense instead of just kind of half-baking and just kind of dropping the 4.6 in there without any real performance gains. Let's jump into number 3. So we've gone over kind of the basics, but let's jump into something a little bit more handling wise. Now the SN95 is not a bad handling car, but there are 3 points on the SN95 that really needed the extra help, and they're actually gonna be the last 3. The last one actually isn't the solid rear axle, just to let you know. Number 3, the third reason why the SN95 sucks is the exclusion of subframe connectors. So let me explain this a little bit quick. The Ford Mustang of that generation is not a body-on-frame car, because God, I don't think the Mustang ever was a body-on-frame car. It's a unibody, and it has a front subframe and a rear subframe. And pretty much what's connecting both of those two parts of the car is all the sheet metal. In the front, you have the engine, the front suspension. In the rear, you have, the rear suspension, the rear axle, all that stuff. You just have the sheet metal just holding both of these parts of the car. When it comes to aggressive handling of the car will tend to kind of get a little bit out of shape because this is going this way, this is going that way, and the whole car is actually flexing. Since I've autocrossed these cars, I can definitely tell you in the slalom area where you're transitioning from left to right to left to right, the car can get really loose because the engine's going this way, the rear end is now catching up because it is all flexing slightly. What subframe connectors do is they literally connect the front and rear of the car together with these really big pieces of metal. That's the best way I can put it. It definitely allows you to tighten up your transitions because guess what? Now the front and the rear of the car are directly connected. It's not just being connected by the thinner sheet metal that tends to flex a little bit. This is just really heavy duty metal that's connecting the front of the car and the rear of the car. Now the reason why Ford excluded it, probably because of price. Ironically, towards the end of the SN95 New Edge generation, they actually did have subframe connectors installed on these cars. Yeah, they actually did. I believe it was on the Mach 1 they had bolt-in subframe connectors, and a little bit fuzzy on this one, I also believe the Terminator Cobra, because Ford knew that the chassis flexed. In your base model V6, that's okay, but say anything in your GT and above where you actually want to do some performance driving, you definitely want to make sure that the car is not falling all over itself because it's so loose. You definitely want to tighten up the chassis. Easily, number 3 is that they did not put subframe connectors in the car from the factory. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I've pretty much always have had Ford automobiles. However, I have had a couple other ones. One of them was a 1987 Toyota AE86. Yes, I actually owned a Hachiroku, and I was actually rather shocked. The suspension was more sophisticated than my 2001 Roush Stage 2. Yes, a car that was considerably older is actually more sophisticated rear suspension-wise than my current Mustang. Now, while that does sound really ridiculous, I'm not really that surprised. I mean, the A86 has a great following because of how good of a car it is. One thing that the A86 has that the Mustang really needed was called a panhard bar. Now, when it comes to the rear suspension of the Mustang, you pretty much have your solid rear axle. Now, the rear axle goes up and down, but it can shift left to right. Say if you're doing some performance driving, that shift can really throw off the balance of the car. What a panhard bar does, it literally makes sure this doesn't shift too far left or right. Because currently with the SN95 Mustangs and also the Fox bodies, you have 4 control arms that are holding the rear axle in. The control arms, of course, control the rear axle, but what controls the side to side? Well, the panhard bar does. However, Ford just does not have it in there. Now, the reason why Ford doesn't have it? Probably because it costs money. Yep, the reason why Ford decided to not put in a piece of suspension work and would have made a much better handling car is probably because it would just simply cost more. This actually will go right into the first reason why the SN95 sucks. Yep, we're going to talk about it. The rear suspension. Since I've already kind of touched on it a little bit when it comes to the panhard bar, I'm going to talk more in depth about how the SN95's rear suspension really is pretty mediocre. Now let me make one thing absolutely clear. The solid rear axle is not the problem. It has to do with the control arm layout. Now going back to my A86, what really shocked me is that all 4 of the control arms are parallel. So here's the solid rear axle, here's control arm 1, 2, 3, 4. They're all going the same way, which means when the suspension goes up and down or it flexes, they can all move in unison. This definitely makes for a much better handling car. And of course with the panhard bar in there, well, I have to admit, my A86 actually had a much better rear suspension setup. Now on the Mustang, on the SN95 Mustang, the Fox body, pretty much actually everything from 1978 that's rear wheel drive Ford, you know, they have their solid rear axle, they have an outer control arm, one on each side that's straight, but then to kind of maximize on interior space, they took the 2 smaller ones, instead of putting them parallel, they put them like this, they put them at an angle. Now, for a base model car, like for example the Fairmont, the LTD, that's just a family car, that's not a problem. But the Mustang is a sporty car that's going to be handling a lot of power, it's going to be driven aggressively. What happens is this phenomenon known as snap oversteer. Being that I do autocross my Ford Mustang, I have come to know when it happens and kind of accept that that's just a design flaw. See, pretty much what happens is all the energy that the car gathers while going around a turn gets stored up, and the suspension should be able to flex and be able to dissipate that energy. Well, that would work except for those 2 little upper control arms that are just put it the wrong way. They bind, they start to hold in all the energy instead of dissipating it. So what happens is after you go around an entire turn and you straighten out, well, all the energy now has to go another direction. And guess what? Say if you're going around a turn just like this, it literally will throw the car in the other direction because all the energy is stored up here. It isn't going anywhere else because pretty much those control arms are not flexing like they should. So once you come out of that corner, guess what happens? The rear of the car starts to spin around because all the energy is now getting unsprung. So that is probably the biggest problem with the car. In daily driving, it's not an issue, but man, if you're doing any sort of autocrossing or road racing, you will definitely learn to know that, yeah, binding is going to happen. Now, the way to fix that is, coincidentally enough, a panhard bar. That helps. And so does actually pretty much redesign the whole rear end of the car. Yes, it's kind of embarrassing to admit that to make this a good handling car that's good for all-around racing, you have to put a couple of thousands of dollars into suspension work into what is a sporty car. Why do you think I'm saying the SN95 sucks? True, you need that work on the Fox body as well, but at least the Fox body is lighter and a hell of a lot more cheaper. But to be honest, I have noticed that SN95s are now the cheaper ones of the bunch, but then you're missing the lightness and I guess now the vintage cool factor of a Fox body. So there you have it. Those are the 5 reasons why the SN95 sucks. If you like this kind of content or you hate me, go ahead and give me a subscribe and tell me why I'm wrong down below in the comments.